This is The Writing Game, and I'm Gregory Palaci. Some claim there's no place for story in games. I'm going to make a bold claim and argue that all games tell a story. It's just that some games don't have a plot. What comes first when you set out to tell a story? The kind of plot you want to tell or the lead character you have in mind? This question is the equivalent of that old debate about whether something is plot driven or character driven. The distinction is meaningless, really, as a character's actions are what determine the plot, and the plot is the sum total of a character's actions. That's from The Story Grid, What Good Editors Know by Sean Coyne. But wait, Greg, aren't you contradicting yourselves by saying that a character's actions determine a plot? Not at all, because not all games have characters. Some simply have a player-sized hole. Think of some of the most well-known games to date. Tetris, PUBG, League of Legends. Each game will be completed and tell its story regardless of the player. Someone can in effect sit there and do nothing. Granted, that is a choice, but not one that creates a plot. It only tells a very limited story. Whereas games with plots are those that won't tell a story without the player. Think of The Witcher 3, Mass Effect, and Firewatch. So why does one have a plot and another not? It goes beyond choice. It's cause and effect. It's choices. The player makes a choice and has to experience a change that decision enacted. They must deal with the consequences and to adapt to them or to seek or set them right, whatever right might be. Choosing to do nothing in PUBG does not count as a plot, not just because the game goes on without you, but because you never experience the effects of your one and only decision, aside from dying because either another player kills you or the blue wall of lightning gets you. In a lot of ways, system-heavy games, especially those focused on multiplayer, are the equivalent of procedurals on TV. The setup is always the same, the outcome rarely different, and week in, week out, the world will reset. This consistency is why we see so many police, legal, or medical procedurals. They're situations that enable the main characters to encounter new situations and individuals every week. But fundamentally, those characters are not required to change, nor is the situation. Why? Because that's not the story. The story is of someone doing their job. The plot, well, if there is one, happens over the season or seasons. CSI, Numbers, The Mentalist all did it this way. They had the main characters coming up against an antagonist who wasn't in every episode, who would tease out the chase over a season or more. Why? Well, because each show needed a hook. That made them different from the others, because their structures were so formulaic. So much so that more often than not, the killer was the third character introduced that episode. Law and Order is particularly bad at this, and it's not the writer's fault. They're working within the constraints of their medium, namely time and budget. So, having more characters in the mix gets very difficult if the crime is to be solved in that episode. But watch a season and count how often the third new character is the killer. Of course, this isn't true for shows like Criminal Minds, where the culprit is generally shown from the beginning. But by and large, it holds true for any procedural. Legal and medical have their own structures, as they generally aren't concerned with finding murderers. But again, their structures are such that the story resets at the end of every episode, much in the way a multiplayer match does. I could argue this is realistic because people don't change that much. They get on with their jobs and they try to do their best and continue their lives avoiding change. That's true to a degree, but as far as art goes in the case of procedurals, as it is with many games, the creators want people to return. And how do you get a person to return? by keeping things the same. Your audience can pick up Season 7 of Law & Order to find it no different than Season 1, even if they haven't seen the intervening episodes. The same is true for games, much to the bane of any creator who's tried to create a sequel only to have their audience cry out in dismay at how the original was much better. But getting people to return time and again to a game is about more than addictive inclusions like loot boxes. It's about creating the same feeling. So now may be the best time to talk not loot boxes, but RPG mechanics. And yes, for some games, those can be one and the same. But yet, there's a reason we're seeing more and more such mechanics and progression systems included in types of games that didn't previously have them. RPG mechanics are the equivalent of season-long antagonists in procedurals. They're there to tell the audience something may change the next time around. They're a hook to keep people coming back for more. But that change is never guaranteed, and what does change is minimal. Progression isn't a plot, but it is telling a story. The story of the player. Within that story is a limited choice. One that may seem significant to the player, but in reality, no way affects the game state. So players can return time and again and find the game, much like the procedural, is what they experienced previously. This is not me hating on RPG mechanics. I've put far too many hours into games like Halo, Titanfall, and Destiny for me to say otherwise. I'm happy to have those very elements in my games. I simply recognize them for what they are. Hooks. And I know you're saying RPG mechanics in Halo? Well, in Halo 5 and even in Halo Reach, trying to unlock armor and weapons is the equivalent of RPG mechanics. It's loot, it may not affect your abilities, but still, I consider it part of the RPG mechanics. After all, every time I play Halo multiplayer, one set of Spartans has not overcome another, nor has the IMC crushed the militia in Titanfall and in Destiny and its sequel. I have not, in fact, become legend, not for lack of trying, but because I haven't really changed the world, solar system. That progression is so well worked out and tweaked to keep enticing players to remain engaged, or if loot boxes are available, to purchase them, that it's hard to say there's much choice within that progression. Obviously there is, depending on the build you're going for. Yet we hear time and again, players, commentators, journalists, basically anyone engaged in the games community discussing the meta. The existence of meta may be great for strategizing the best tactics for competitive play. When it comes to plot though, it's a death blow. All because choice is severely limited. But more on choice in a future episode. This episode too, but more specific examination of choice in a future episode. There are system-heavy games, or systems-driven, I use both terms interchangeably, that try to tell a story with something that resembles a plot. RimWorld and how it remembers and connects disparate actions is a great example. Your crew may create items, be they sculptures or utensils, which are dedicated to the memory of earlier events in the game. Again, though this doesn't qualify as plot according to the aforementioned definition, namely choice, yes, the player can specify which of a dozen activities a character should do and can even specify the character's preference to minimize micromanagement, but as the player, our story is limited and plotless, even if we are telling a story. And it all comes back to this interacting with art. With previous mediums we find within video games, such as film, poetry, literature, music, art, etc., we have only ever had a binary choice. To read, watch, listen, observe, or not. It's very black and white. Video games, story-focused video games, change that up. They throw out the old dichotomy and instead welcome a spectrum of possibility, but don't always. The games of Fulbright are two great examples. Gone Home, while a narrative game and deridingly called a walking simulator by some, is very similar to systems-heavy games. It ostensibly has a story, and a very moving one. In all honesty, it made me cry, and I'm glad it did, because right there should be proof enough that video games are art. But I digress. Gone Home has a story, but there isn't a plot, all because the story has already been told. We as players are not affecting it one way or another, nor are we learning about the character we're playing. Instead, we're archaeologists uncovering the events of the past. Gone Home, like a novel, only gives us a single choice, to engage or not engage. The story has already been written. It's only a matter of if we learn it. Gone Home has us inhabiting the role of Katie Greenbrier, who, for all intents and purposes, is a player-sized whole. Though, through that role, we learn of our relationships with our family and how they've developed in our absence. Conversely, Tacoma, Fulbright's newest game, is one with two stories, one of which has a plot that you, the player, determine to some degree. Like its predecessor, though, the story of Tacoma has already happened, and as a player, we are merely revealing it. The plot part is in regards to how much you engage in the story, because like many systems-driven games, it'll finish with you, as the player, providing minimal input. That choice to play microgravity basketball and do nothing else is an interesting one. It can say a lot about the character you play, Amy Ferrier, but the wider implications for that are few and far between. The significant choices the player character makes are never ones that the player is allowed to determine, thus relinquishing a certain amount of player control for the sake of the creator's message. But again, Amy, like her predecessor, Kate, is little more than a player-sized whole, because there's little to who she is that affects how we play, what choices we're presented with, and how we develop as the story goes along. Compare that to another walking simulator, Firewatch by Campo Santo. Like the others, I thoroughly enjoyed this game and find myself constantly thinking about it. Firewatch is a game that's all about story, or more correctly, choice. The result is a game with a plot. Unlike the previously mentioned games, Gone Home and Tacoma, in Firewatch's case, the player is given a plethora of choices. Choices that affect how others react to the player character, what information is available to the player, and what we, as the player, know about the character we play. Some may find this hard to understand because the choices aren't explicitly signposted, not in the way they were in a series like Mass Effect, where you knew if you were taking a Paragon or a Renegade action. That choice to signpost things or not is a matter of some discussion in a future episode. But for now, it's simply something worth noting because it's a style and gameplay decision that affects how players interact and encounter a story. Firewatch is as subtle as games can be, in that there are consequences to your actions. They just aren't all signposted. You're not told you're going to gain +2 charisma or fancy new binoculars. Take, for example, the choice presented involving some teens and their radio. You can take the radio, turn it off, throw it on the ground, throw it in a bush, throw it in the lake. Basically, trash the thing. Your choice says a lot about you as both a player and a character, but it also has implications for later in the story, when you encounter with the teen has its inevitable consequence. Throughout the entire game, not just this sequence, the game never says so-and-so will remember this, as is common to Telltale games. It's not to say the results of your actions in Firewatch are solely in your mind's eye, rather there are real-world effects, but the differences between one course of action or another are never explicitly explained. All of it, though, is in the service of developing the plot, and thus the character of Henry. Developing the character of Henry, or any character for that matter, isn't a matter of the game being about role-playing, but rather enabling choices which reflect upon the person and the situation they're in. Games are always going to tell stories. Any designer who says they're trying to evoke a feeling is seeking to tell a story, but with the player at the center. How you do that isn't always going to have a plot, That doesn't mean you can't tell a story with a plot. It's just all a matter of perspective when it comes to game design. Regardless of whether you're writing the story being told by your game or you're planning out the plot the player character will experience, be sure to ask yourself this one question. Is the character active or reactive? This episode started with the purpose of discussing the differences between plot and story, yet very quickly degenerated into an exploration of choice in video games, because choice is plot. So it's safe to say that choice will be explored further in future episodes as it relates to character and design. But as much choice as a game may give a player, that doesn't mean there's a plot. There's always a story to a game, though. A creator's decision for how the story is told in relation to a player's character and the verbs available is going to affect if there's a plot. It all comes down to whether there's a player-sized hole to fill or if the player is inhabiting a character that can be explored or changed. And even then, it's a question of if that character is active or reactive. More on characters, choice, and the rules of storytelling in future episodes. For now, think on everything I've said, and let's take Assassin's Creed Origins as an example. As a little bit of homework for you, think on, is the character of Bayek active or reactive? And does he have choice? But then do you, as the player, have choice in regards to Bayek? And what that says about whether you're simply filling a player-sized hole or you're inhabiting the character of Bayek. You can let me know what you think by leaving comments below or hitting me up on Twitter at OneGameDad. Thanks for taking part in this episode of The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Palachi. Everything I do can be found at OneGameDad.com, and I can be reached there or on Twitter at OneGameDad. If you want to talk writing, games, this show, or even working together, I'm always happy to hear from you. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net. Please be sure to like and subscribe or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode.